the North. Northwest Territories, Yukon and Alaska. In 1995, our younger daughter Kathy and her husband Mike had recently moved to northern Alberta, very northern. So we decided to visit, and then to explore the North. It was 3,000 kilometers from Kincardine to Glacier National Park in Montana. Glacier National Park provided some great views of the Rockies, Wild Goose Island, Lake McDonald, and the Sunrift Gorge. From there, we went across the border that is marked by a cleared strip of land at the 49th parallel to Waterton Lakes National Park in Alberta, a place that had been on our to-do list for a while. It's easy to see why we wanted to visit this beautiful location, as well as Upper Waterton Lake, where the Prince of Wales Hotel is impressively situated. There is Summit Lake and Cameron Lake, with its wildlife and its falls, and beautiful Red Rock Canyon. When we lived in Calgary, Edmonton seemed like the end of the world. Now our daughter lived 9 hours, 860 kilometers north of Edmonton. They lived in Fort Vermilion, on the bank of the Peace River, a major river that flows northeast. Later, on our way to the Yukon, we stopped at another historic Peace River settlement, Dunvegan, 400 kilometers south of Fort Vermilion. We went with Kathy and Mike to Yellowknife in the Northwest Territories, 800 kilometers further north. It is on the shore of Great Slave Lake, the deepest in North America. The real north starts at 60 degrees north latitude. With different flora and fauna. We passed Hay River and camped at Lady Evelyn Falls, where I tried unsuccessfully to catch fish. We crossed Canada's longest river, the Mackenzie River, by ferry. It empties into the Arctic Ocean. Yellowknife is the capital and the only city in the Northwest Territories. Established in the 1930s as a base for prospectors looking for gold, this bush plane memorial recognizes those who traveled into the interior by bush plane. The city developed in the 40s and 50s, and in more recent years has continued to develop. In 1991, diamonds were discovered, and prospecting changed. We camped outside of town on Prelude Lake, but we came into the city for supper at the long-established Wildcat Cafe. Being so far north, the aurora borealis can frequently be seen. We returned to Fort Vermilion with Kathy and Mike, and then continued south to start the Alaska Highway at Mile 0 in Dawson Creek, BC. These images give an idea of how the highway developed from construction to present day. The trip up the highway wasn't as interesting as I'd hoped it would be, but we did see some wildlife. We drove through Fort St. John and Fort Nelson, Alaska Highway Army Workshop locations where some of my REME officer peers had been posted when I had been posted way down south at one field workshop in Calgary. Although my memory is incomplete, I think we camped at Muncho Lake. The next day we passed Smith River Falls, stopped to see the forest of signs at Watson Lake, and camped at Tarfu Lake. Nearby are other lakes we visited, like Snafu Lake. Tarfu is a military term meaning things are really fouled up. We went to Carcross to see the Northwest Mounted Police Detachment building with its sod roof. Unfortunately, the most significant event of the trip occurred here, when the transmission on the RV failed and we had to be towed into Whitehorse. We donned our costumes as Soapy Smith and a Northwest Mounted Police constable to fit into the area. The town was filled with interesting buildings and sights. Notable to us was this Anglican bishop, who came from our town of Kincardine. We were now 1,400 kilometers along the Alaska Highway. Built during the post-war boom in Whitehorse for much-needed residential accommodation is this log cabin skyscraper. That was a definite step up from this logger's cabin on the Yukon River that flows through Whitehorse. One of our more pleasant events was to take a float trip on the river with Willie, an interesting local native. Travel to and from Whitehorse had been on the Yukon River, using the SS Klondike that we toured. We spent 7 days in Whitehorse, waiting for the transmission to be replaced, so we had more time than we needed to see the town and the area. Another landmark was the cabin of Sam McGee, made famous in Robert Service's poem, The Cremation of Sam McGee. The poem speaks of him being cremated on frozen Lake LaBerge, so we rented a car so we could see this lake, and also some other lakes and rivers in the area. I tried once again, unsuccessfully, to catch a fish. We had lots of time to kill in Whitehorse, so after we covered everything, including the botanical garden, we also spent a couple of days reading in the library. We headed up the Alaska Highway once more towards Dawson City. One of our stops along the way was the Five Finger Rapids. Robert Service was inspired by the view of these rapids to write the poem The Call of the Wild, which begins, "Have you gazed on naked grandeur where there's nothing else to gaze on?" 500 kilometers further north, our next major stop was Dawson City, the second largest town in the Yukon Territory. Some things haven't changed from the gold rush days. The streets are still dirt with board sidewalks. This historical residence was for the chief government executive of the Yukon. Robert Service, a bank clerk, moved from Whitehorse to Dawson City in 1908. His poems were based on gold rush stories. Although not appreciated by literary critics at the time, they became very popular. The cabin he lived in is still an historic site. When we were there, this man, Tom Byrne, recited poems by Service. As well as the poem The Spell of the Yukon here on the side of a building, one of my favorite poems is Dangerous Dan McGrew.
Of the boys were whooping it up the Malamute Cafe, and back of the bar in a poker game sat a man that everyone knew. He was grim and cold, he was bad and bold, he was Dangerous Dan McGrew. And while Dangerous Dan was a-playing his hand and keeping his mind on his game, you could see standing by with a gleam in her eye and her hair just as red as a flame, a gal who was tall with a face like a doll and her fingernails painted blue. Oh, a gal who was tall with a face like a doll, the lady that's known as Lou. Out of the night, which was 50 below, and into the din and the glare, a man staggered in who was haggard and thin, and his face was filled with despair. Now he looked all around until he had found the lady that's known as Lou. And then the stranger turned and his eyes they burned on Dangerous Dan McGrew. And then suddenly, wham, all the lights went out and a voice cried, "Die you must!" And then a woman screamed and a shot rang out and somebody bit the dust. And then the lights flashed on and the Northwest Mounted Police came a-crashing through. They drew their guns and they said, "Which one is Dangerous Dan McGrew?" And then somebody said, "Woo-woo, they're so big," and skipped across the floor. A 1-2 skip, hand on hip, right out through the open door. Now was it the stranger a-taking his leave, or the lady that's known as Lou? It was nobody else in this whole wide world but Dangerous Dan McGrew.
I considered another one of the highlights of Dawson City to be Diamond Tooth Gertie's. With music hall dancers and gambling, perennial favorites. It was another 500 kilometers west to Fairbanks, Alaska. We took the ferry across the Yukon River on the top of the World Highway, as this portion of the Alaska Highway is known. It gets that name because it's one of the northernmost highways in North America, and it follows ridge lines, providing great views. Passing through Chicken, Alaska. This statue in Fairbanks recognizes the unknown first indigenous family to settle here. In the museum, we saw these mastodon tusks. While we were there was demonstration of indigenous contests, games, and dances. There wasn't much more to see in Fairbanks, so we headed to Anchorage, 400 kilometers south. Because of our delay in Whitehorse, we didn't stop at Denali National Park, other than to take some pictures from the highway, where we had views of Mount McKinley. Other images from the internet indicate that we missed some great scenery. We continued on down to Anchorage, where we didn't stay long, but I remember being amazed at the busy seaplane airport in the middle of the city. Autumn was approaching quickly, although it was still August, so we didn't dawdle in Anchorage. Leaving Anchorage, we drove up the Matanuska Valley, seeing the glacier of the same name. It was 1,200 kilometers to Haines, Alaska, where we had a ferry reservation. Looking at the map, I was surprised to find we had to go back into the Yukon and then passed within 130 kilometers of Whitehorse on this leg of our trip. On the way, we saw this interesting church, the first one built northwest of Whitehorse on the Alaska Highway. We camped at Kluane National Park. And hiked up the Sheep Mountain Trail, which you can see took a bit of effort. But we made it, and it was worthwhile. Some other images from the internet give some additional views. The internet also provided these images of the Dall sheep, for which this mountain is named. At Haines, these former officers' quarters dated from the period when the U.S. Army base was located here during the negotiations on the international boundary between the U.S. and Canada. This fish wheel is a local method of catching fish. Although our camper was on board, we had booked a cabin for the overnight ferry trip. Traveling down the inside passage was pleasant, with great views, when there was no fog. I think we were 2 nights on the ferry. There were stops at Juneau, Petersburg, and Wrangell in Alaska before we reached Prince Rupert, BC. It's fortunate we took this trip when we did. This ferry no longer operates because the RCMP no longer provides immigration control at Prince Rupert. We visited the North Pacific Cannery at Prince Rupert. It operated from 1888 to 1985. These were the houses of the Japanese fishermen who had worked there. By the time we arrived at Vancouver Island on the BC ferry from Prince Rupert, we had put over 10,000 kilometers on our RV, then to the mainland, and it was another 4,000 kilometers home, after a trip that provided many memories.